Hi. So the last pod focused on key terms, and that section's something you can come back to over the course of the semester too, so don't forget it's there. In this pod, I want to get back to one of the overarching themes of this subject, and that's the art of storytelling, and how we might use storytelling to build knowledge. So let's start off with something light. I've just got a quick 5-minute presentation about the technology of storytelling. Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, gather around. I would love to share with you a story. Once upon a time in 19th century Germany, there was the book. Now, during this time, the book was the king of storytelling. It was venerable. It was ubiquitous. But it was a little bit boring. Because in its 400 years of existence, storytellers never evolved the book as a storytelling device. But then one author arrived, and he changed the game forever. His name was Lothar Meggendorfer. Lothar Meggendorfer put his foot down, and he said, "Genug ist genug." He grabbed his pen, he snatched his scissors. This man refused to fold to the conventions of normalcy and just decided to fold. History would know Lothar Meggendorfer as, who else? The world's first true inventor of the children's pop-up book. For this delight and for this wonder, people rejoiced. They were happy because the story survived and that the world would keep on spinning. Lothar Meggendorfer wasn't the first to evolve the way a story was told, and he certainly wasn't the last. Whether storytellers realized it or not, they were channeling Meggendorfer's spirit when they moved opera to vaudeville, radio news to radio theater, film to film in motion, to film in sound, color, 3D, on VHS and on DVD. There seemed to be no cure for this Meggendorferitis. And things got a lot more fun when the internet came around. Because not only could people broadcast their stories throughout the world, but they can do so with what seemed to be an infinite amount of devices. For example, one company would tell a story of love through its very own search engine. One Taiwanese production studio would interpret American politics in 3D. And one man would tell the stories of his father by using a platform called Twitter to communicate the excrement his father would gesticulate. And after all this, everyone paused. They took a step back. They realized that in 6,000 years of storytelling, they've gone from depicting hunting on cave walls to depicting Shakespeare on Facebook walls. And this was a cause for celebration. The art of storytelling has remained unchanged, and for the most part, the stories are recycled. But the way that humans tell the stories has always evolved with pure, consistent novelty. And they remembered a man, one amazing German, every time a new storytelling device popped up next. And for that, the audience, the lovely, beautiful audience, would live happily ever after.
Now I'd like to turn to this week's reading, The Interactive Onion, Layers of User Participation in Digital Narrative Texts by Marie-Laure Ryan. This reading's a core reading for this subject because the material it deals with is useful and pertinent for your second assignment, so keep that in mind too. Now, one of the reasons this week's reading is important is because we're not just looking at how people write in contemporary society. We're also looking at how the way people read is changing, and specifically the role of the reader in content making. Now, considering that you're all future content makers, this is vital. These ideas are vital for you to engage with. If people are now reading differently, and expecting far more than simply words on a page, how is that affecting us as a society? Are we ending up with material that favours form over content, smoke and mirrors? Does it favour how something looks rather than what it actually says? Now, if that's the case, how should you, as a future content maker, think about how to get information across? How are you going to keep your readers, viewers engaged? In this week's, I'm just going to do a summary of the reading now. In this week's reading, Ryan begins by asking if there's even such a thing as interactive stories. So she starts off by citing two researchers, Carolyn Handler-Miller and Mark Meadows, and they both regard the existence of interactive narratives as an indisputable fact. They both talk about a wide variety of interactive texts that involve a story. So computer games, interactive TV, smart toys like talking dolls, hypertext fiction, websites devoted to history, that's just to name a few. But Ryan points out that since these scholars don't regard the combination of narrativity and interactivity as an issue, their work is limited to sort of superficial advice on how to improve the design of digital stories. Ryan then goes on to cite other scholars, Glasner and Crawford, who have different opinions again about what makes an interactive story. Ryan then asks, who's right? And she goes on to answer in a way which I hope we're all starting to become familiar with. She says, it all depends on what we mean by interactive story. So she's stopping before she even starts to explain what she's talking about. She stops and she gives you a definition, and she explains exactly what she means by interactive story. So in this paper, she continues, quote, I would like to argue that digital texts are like an onion made of different layers of skin, and that interactivity can affect different levels, end quote. So Ryan's arguing that the outer layers, and please remember that I'm summarising here, on the outer layers, interactivity concerns the presentation of the story. In the middle layers, interactivity concerns the user's personal involvement in the story, even though the plot of a story is still predetermined, so you can't change it. Then finally, on the inner layers of the onion, the story is created dynamically through the interaction between the user and the system, so us and how we're using the computer in the story. Her paper goes on, in her words, to peel the interactive onion by discussing a number of texts that illustrate the different layers of interactivity, all the way from the outside of the onion all the way to the core. And she goes on to explain the way she will use the term interactivity, quote, when I say interactivity in relation to a digital text, you all understand what I have in mind, the user's ability to provide input to the computer and the computer's ability to adjust its behaviour according to this input. The scholar Chris Crawford believes that an interactive text is a text that offers choice to the user. This is Ryan speaking still, I agree that choice is a necessary condition of interactivity, but it's not sufficient. Not all objects that offer choices are themselves interactive. For instance, a sign at a crossroad that points in different directions offers many destinations to the traveller, or a printed menu in a restaurant offers many options to the customer. But I would not call the road sign or the menu interactive objects, because they lack the ability to modify themselves in response to the user's decisions. So something else I hope you're all starting to get used to is the way scholarly articles work as genres. So not just how they break down terms, but how they're structured. And they become very specific in terms of the argument that they're making. So Ryan goes on to say that for her, an interactive text involves choice, but it also involves a two-sided effort that creates a feedback loop. Her paper then goes on to divide the onion into 4 layers for ease of explanation. She calls level 1 peripheral interactivity. She uses the example of a work called Cruising, a poem. She explains that the story is framed by an interactive story, but this doesn't affect the story itself or the order in which the story is told. So the basic story of the poem is a memory of growing up in a small Wisconsin town. The user's action consists of controlling the display. So by moving the cursor, the reader can make the text and its graphic background grow or shrink, move left or right, or move at different speeds. And the goal is to get a combination of size, speed and direction that allows the text to be deciphered. So for most of the time, the letters are too small to read or they move too fast. But the user's control of the speed and direction simulates the driving of a car. So driving a car is what the text is all about. However, no matter how fast or slow the car moves, no matter whether it goes forward or backwards, it's still the same text that's rolling before our eyes. So sometimes we can read it, sometimes we can't. But we can't stop it, we can't skip any part of that text, and we can't change the order of it. Now she goes to level 2, which she calls interactivity affecting narrative discourse and the presentation of story. So on this level of the onion, so to speak, the materials that make up the story are still predetermined, you can't change them, but there are interactive mechanisms which enable us as the user or the reader to change the presentation of that story if we want to. This type of interactivity requires hypertext, so it's a collection of documents interconnected by digital links, so that when a user selects a link, a new document comes to the screen. That's the structure known as hypertext. One example she refers to is classical hypertext fiction. You'll see a figure here, the sea anemone and a maze structure. Some examples of hypertext, such as Shelley Jackson's Patchwork Girl and M.D. Coverley's Califia, have been influenced by the idea of the searchable archive, and they adopt the radiating design of the sea anemone, as we just saw in the figure, at least on the top level. So the formal characteristic of the network structure is the existence of loops that offer several different ways to get to the same node. These loops make it possible to circle forever in the network, and this explains why the image of the labyrinth and the notion of book without end play such an important role in hypertext theory. Now Ryan goes on to expand on this quite significantly, and I don't have the time to cover that for you here or summarise it here. So make sure that you're taking notes when you do go through this, possibly when you're going through the lecture and then again when you go through the reading, so you can be sure to understand it. Then we go to level 3. Interactivity creating variations in a partly predefined story. So on this level, the user becomes a part of the story, is actually a member of the story world. The system grants the user or the player some freedom, but they still progress along a fixed storyline, and the system remains in firm control of the narrative and the way the plot progresses. Now this type of interactivity is of course typical of computer games. In the text that Ryan mentions above in her reading, participation is external and exploratory. In this example, in the example of computer games, it's internal and either ontological or exploratory. Internal participation means that a user has a body or an avatar in the fictional world, and that the actions available to him or her are not merely abstract ways to see more of the text, but they actually represent a physical engagement of the avatar with the surrounding world. So the avatar can move, jump, build, shoot, kill, pick up objects and look around. So when the actions available to the user consist merely of moving around the world and looking at things, participation is exploratory. When the avatar has the power to change the world or to affect the destiny of the avatar, participation is ontological. So internal exploratory participation is found in those games in which the mission of the player consists of solving a mystery, such as a murder case. These games connect two narrative levels. The level of the story being investigated by the avatar or by the user, which is written into the game, and the level of the investigation, which is what's variable, since that's what's created by you, by the user, the avatar. Now, of course, the most common form of participation in video games is ontological. We find examples of this whenever the life of the avatar or your life in the game is at stake. In this case, we can say that each run of the game creates a new story for the avatar and a new history for the fictional world, explains Ryan. And here we can see a figure of the predetermined narrative. So the dominant narrative structure for ontological participation is the archetypal story of the quest of the hero. In a quest narrative, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the hero fulfills his or her mission by performing a series of tasks of increasing difficulty. The game determines the theme of the mission and the sequence of the tasks, but the player's performance creates variation on this fixed frame. So these variations differ from each other in how the avatar solves the problems, in the success or failure of his or her quest, and in the case of failure, in the time and manner of the player's death. Now, as Ryan then goes on to point out, this formula has been very successful, but the reason for the success is partly to do with the fact that game players don't really care about the narrative. They're not playing for the story, but for the adrenaline rush of competition, for fun. For a game to be worth playing out of narrative interest, storyline must grow out of opportunities for interaction, and vice versa. These opportunities must grow naturally out of the story. Of course, there's no recipe for achieving this feat. The easiest way to combine narrative development and interactivity, she says, is to present the story by means of non-interactive movie clips, known as cutscenes. Cutscenes introduce into games the narrative power of film, and for many players they might constitute a reward for being promoted to a new level or to getting ahead. But this can of course still be frustrating if, as many players don't, you don't care about the story. Scholar Chris Crawford calls this approach a constipated story, and Stephen Poole regards it as frustrating for both lovers of games and lovers of stories. Now again, an aside, note that this part in the reading, when you come to read Ryan's article in full, I'd like you to take note of what she says might be a more elegant and dynamic way to reveal the story. Because again, I don't have time to cover the entire piece, so go back and read that for yourself, please. And finally, level 4, real-time story. On level 4, or within level 4, stories are not predetermined, but rather generated on the fly out of data that comes in part from the system and in part from the user or player. So in this case, every run of the program should result in a different story, and the program should therefore be replayable. But to this day, explains or points out Ryan, we don't really have a story-generating system sufficiently sophisticated to produce a wide variety of interesting stories out of this data that's already internal to the system. So integrating the user's input in the generating process only raises the difficulty to a higher level. So Ryan asks us to consider the discrepancy between the goals of authors, writers, and the goals of people engaged in living their own life. So of course, when we're living our own life, we ask, what action can I take to solve this or that problem, to reach a more satisfactory state of affairs for myself in the future? But when we tell a story, we're starting from a situation that we find interesting, and we might ask, what course of events led to this situation? The visitors of an interactive narrative system plays the role of a character in a virtual world, and they adopt that forward-looking perspective of life. But when we're faced with a problem in real life, we want to resolve it as quickly and efficiently as possible. But the author who creates a story is more interested, of course, in actions that produce opportunities for interesting plot developments rather than efficient problem solving. So Ryan uses this example of the conflict between the goals of a character and the goals of authors and writers in the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. So as an example, she's saying when the hungry wolf meets the little girl in the forest, why doesn't he just eat her on the spot rather than waiting until she reaches her grandmother's house? The wolf's taking the risk that Little Red Riding Hood will never find the grandmother's house, or that another wolf might come along and eat her in the meantime. But from the perspective of the storyteller, the plan of the wolf is infinitely superior, of course, to the practical solution. And that's because it prepares the highly dramatic episode of the wolf tricking the heroine by taking place with the grandmother in bed, and the climactic event of their confrontation. Now, Little Red Riding Hood, of course, is not a very promising scheme for interactive narrative, because the other options that offer themselves to the wolf or to the little girl are vastly inferior in terms of dramatic interest. So Ryan says we don't yet have a set of guidelines for interactive drama. From a programming point of view, the major problem to be resolved at this level 4, the core of the onion, the inner layer of the onion, is to find a compromise between a top-down design that reflects the author's goals and guarantees proper narrative form and a proper plot, or a bottom-up, emergent design that simulates life by generating events chronologically as the player or user experiences them. Again, I don't have time here in this format to cover how Ryan continues to theorise on this topic, but now that I've summarised the beginning of the reading, I'd like you to finish it off by yourself. But before you do that, I'd like you to watch the next pod.